Forum, I'm Andrew Gilligan, and this is the topical debate show where the people ask the questions. Today, the question is, has the Labour Party lost the will to live? There's still, you might think, plenty to play for. It was government action, in many commentators' view, that prevented the economic crisis becoming a catastrophe. There's perhaps a lack of real public enthusiasm for the Tories. The electoral system is biased in Labour's favour. To take power, David Cameron needs a huge swing. Yet Cameron's lead in most polls is increasing. Many in the Labour Party appear to have given up already. And of course, Labour appears quite unable to tackle what those same polls say is one of its biggest liabilities, its leader. So in the face of a widely expected Tory victory, can Labour still turn it round, or at least peg it back? Is its problem really Gordon, or is it something more fundamental? After the embrace of the city, the wars, the expenses, has Labour simply stopped believing in itself? Does it actually want to win, or has it had enough? To discuss all this, an excellent panel. To my right, Claudia Webbe, Vice Chair of the Islington South Constituency Labour Party in London. To her right, Greg Foxsmith, a Liberal Democrat councillor and campaigner. To my left, Michael White, a columnist from the Guardian newspaper. And to his left, Tony Devenish, a Conservative councillor for the City of Westminster. Welcome to you all. First of all, time for me to announce that if you'd like to be part of our studio audience here in London, you can call our hotline on 0208 728 6472 or email us at forum@presstv.co.uk. You should see those details at the bottom of your screen now. And now to the first question. It's from Mark Walker.
Do the panel believe that Labour can win the next election?
Michael White.
In theory it could. It's almost certain that it won't. The real question you already posed, Andrew, there's a curious lack of enthusiasm for the Conservative Party. It isn't like 1997. It isn't even like 1979, which I'm old enough to remember, where Labour had got into very big trouble with the economy primarily, and Margaret Thatcher was there, the new Conservative leader. She was a tough guy, but people were a bit nervous about her, but it was clear the Tories were going to win. And so Labour diehards, and there are still a few, say, if only we can get above 30% and get the Tories down below 30%, and at this point you start to nod on your shoulder because you don't really believe it's going to happen. Nonetheless, if the Tories don't seal the deal with the electorate, then we might be looking at a hung parliament, and that's not something I very often say. Or we might get a Conservative government with a small majority. I really don't think Gordon Brown can pull it off, even though a few people still think so.
OK, Gordon Brown might not be able to pull it off. Can somebody else?
I don't think that's an option. I've never thought it was an option. I think Gordon Brown poisoned all the opposition, all the prospective alternatives to Gordon Brown as the leader of the Labour Party. And if there was somebody who combined the low political cunning of Bill Clinton, the charisma of Nelson Mandela, and the good looks of the President of France's First Lady, then if they were in the cabinet, then that might be different. But I haven't spotted them in the cabinet, so every time you get a plot which says David Miliband, you think, no, not really.
So Jeffrey doesn't qualify under those criteria.
Alan Johnson, he's a really sensible bloke. You'd like him. Why would a sensible bloke want the job? At this stage of the proceedings, he's not ambitious, he's not hungry. You see him on the TV, and you know it. You can see it almost in his eyes. Michael, so it's going to be Gordon.
You're a political journalist. Tell me, do you read anything into this news over the weekend that Gordon's got a retinal tear in his eye? Why was that released? Is there any chance it could be him preparing the way for kind of graceful retirement on the grounds of ill health?
No. In a word, no, Andrew. I don't know how it came out. I don't know why. He's always had eye trouble. Everybody in the audience knows the story, playing sport. He was a good sportsman as a kid. Maybe one of the reasons he's a bit miserable, I mean, I think it's because he's sort of introverted, lives in his head, intellectual kind of guy, but he was also a good rugby player and he was a good tennis player. People don't know that. He could have been the Andy Murray. Who said that? But anyway, he was a good Scottish tennis player. And it was a terrible thing. He lay on his back thinking he might go totally blind for weeks and weeks when he was 16 or 17 years old. So he's always had an eye issue. I think even if he were blind, he'd be still there with his stick on election day.
All right, Tony Devenish, why aren't you doing better?
I think that's a very negative way of putting it, really. I mean, I think
No, it's just a question.
The British public really have got to decide who they want to be the next government. They have given up with the Labour Party. When you think what Labour have done with 12 years, they've achieved absolutely nothing. In 45, they've set the National Health Service up. In the 60s, they set the Open University up. What have they done in the last 12 years? Absolutely nothing. And last week, the Conservative Party at Manchester at their conference set out some really exciting policies. They told the public the state of the finances, which I think is an honest way of going about politics. And it's up to the public at the end of the day, not the politicians, to decide who the next government of this country is. And I think, hopefully, they will decide on David Cameron.
Tony Devonish, Gordon Brown said at the Labour Party conference that your party was faced with the call of the century over the economic crisis, and it called it wrong.
Again, Gordon Brown is the man who caused the economic crisis.
Tush, nonsense.
But I mean,
No,
in terms,
The bankers caused it, Tony. The bankers did it. They stole the bank.
It was the regulation that the Labour Party set up.
Oh.
whether that is true or not,
Well,
nonetheless, it was government intervention.
This is rather important,
all
Andrew.
right.
Everybody's regulation failed. It failed in Germany, where the banks went bust. It failed in France. Failed in the United States, where the great god of regulation, Alan Greenspan, the disciple of Ayn Rand, the great conservative guru, they screwed up. Everybody screwed up. And Brown screwed up. I'll give you that much on the regulation front. But the bankers did it. Everybody in the audience say after me, the bankers did it. Yeah.
Okay.
And Gordon Brown.
Well, look, but, okay, regardless of who caused it, do you not accept that Gordon Brown's response to the economic crisis saved it from being an absolute disaster?
No, I don't accept that at all. I mean, I think all he has done really is spent more of our money. At the end of the day, governments have no money. It's we, the people, that pay the taxes. And he spent more and more and more of our money.
Okay, Claudia Webbe, you're Vice Chair of the constituency Labour Party. Tony Blair's old constituency, I think, Islington South. Your MP has got a majority of about 500 or so from memory. Is she still going to be your MP, your Labour MP, after the next election?
I think when you look at the people that are working hard on the ground, and I think we have to recognise that the Labour Party is greater than the Labour government, and there were hard-working people out there, day in, day out, fighting and seeking to win for Labour. And I think that the game isn't over yet. And there's a strange rule in politics that says those that set the agenda usually win. And I think a year ago one could argue that Labour was actually rising in the opinion polls because it had the Conservatives on the back foot. Left to the Conservatives, you know, they would have not gone for the borrowing and the stimulus that was required to address the economic crisis. And Labour got it right. You needed to have huge state intervention. And if you want to look at what failed, actually Thatcherism failed. All over the world it failed. The ideology failed.
Thatcher left office more than 10 years ago.
No, but the concept of that whole capitalism
Nearly
failed.
20 years ago.
Yeah, well, the concept of eradicating state intervention failed. So across the world, what we saw was huge nationalism going on.
But you can't keep on blaming Thatcher for this. She left office in 1990.
Sure, but in terms of what happened across the world, what we saw was huge nationalism, state intervention to rescue the banks. I think Labour...
Your make it, Andrew, is very well told. You know, the Labour Party are always in opposition. Even when they're government, they're campaigning as an opposition. They've been in power now for 12 years. What have they achieved?
But what was clear in terms of what happened last year, what the Conservatives were saying, they weren't supporting the borrowing and stimulus.
You're in government. You are in government. What have you done in 12 years?
And the way that Labour responded was actually correct. State intervention was actually the right policy. Perhaps what they should have done more about was in actual fact not left the ownership left it to the shareholders and the bankers, so that we should actually still be owning the asset that we rescued. And I think that that's where we could have probably done more.
Right. We've got another question on this coming up, so we'll come back to that later. Greg Portsmouth, frankly, the Liberal Democrats aren't particularly well placed either, are they? I mean, you're going to end up at the next election, if the polls are right, with probably slightly fewer, certainly no more MPs than you've got now. How does that help?
Yeah, the polls are interesting. I mean, we did overtake Labour for the first time earlier this year, but
in one poll.
In one poll, but on the national spread we are generally third. But of course, in a first-past-the-post electoral system, often with the media portraying it as a straight battle between Tory and Labour, that poll doesn't necessarily reflect the reality in each individual constituency. So, for example, in Islington South that we were discussing, it's a straight fight in that particular seat between Lib Dem and Labour. There are other seats where it's Lib Dem against Tory and others where Lib Dem are a clear third. And of course it's all going to depend on how each of those individual battles play out, and there are some seats with a split between three parties.
And who are the Lib Dems going to target? Because part of the reason for the Labour landslide, part of it in '97, was that there was effectively a sort of coordination, unspoken coordination between Labour and the Lib Dems. They didn't fight each other very heavily. They concentrated their fire on the Tories. Is that still the plan? Are you still more inclined to Labour or the Tories? And what happens if there's a hung Parliament?
As to the first question, I'm not sure about the general tactical strategy. I'm certainly not aware of one. In Islington, as I say, it's a straight battle between Labour and Lib Dem. Nationally, of course, we are open to possibilities for coalition government. That is one of the possible outcomes. But if a week is a long time in politics, we've still got a long way to go before the general election. And one thing I'd agree with Claudia on is that even if the Labour government have lost the will to live, the Labour Party haven't. And certainly what we see in Islington, I'm sure it's common in other areas as well, is that local parties are distancing themselves from the government. So in Islington, for example, it's Islington Labour Party, it's not the Labour Party. Gordon Brown doesn't appear on the leaflets, he's sort of airbrushed out of that, and I know that's true in many areas of the country.
Let me press you on this hung Parliament thing. I mean, if, as seems possible, you could choose who you put in power, who would you choose? You personally. Say you were Nick Clegg.
If I was Nick Clegg, I wouldn't make a decision now. You'd have to have a discussion with whatever the outcome of the Parliament is.
Could you see the party propping up a Labour government that had lost quite a lot of votes?
I think that's unlikely, but I don't think anything could be ruled out. It would have to depend on the composition of a
Michael,
new government.
I think
is
it would
this
be impossible to prop up a Labour government which had lost a lot of votes. But equally, try as I may, I can't think that the Lib Dems, who are essentially a party of the centre-left, can very easily support a Conservative government, a minority government perhaps, or a government with a small majority. Maybe tacitly they'll say, look, we won't vote against you. But I can't see coalition with the Tories. That's right against the DNA of the Liberal Democrats.
Do you think that is a way that Labour could hold on to power effectively?
No. I think if you lose, you lose. And older viewers will remember Ted Heath in 1974 tried to get a coalition with the Liberal Democrats, led by a chap called Jeremy Thorpe, who nearly went to jail later. So that was a lucky escape. But no, you can't do it.
Yeah.
You can't do it.
All right, let's go on to another question. This one's from Renee Simmons. Renee Simmons, your question.
How much can Labour's problems be blamed on Gordon Brown?
How much of Labour's problems can be blamed on Gordon Brown? Claudia?
I don't buy into this notion of personality politics.
The voters do.
Well, I think that's a media misconception. I don't actually believe that's where...
That's what they tell the opinion polls.
Well,
they say they'd vote for, more likely to vote Labour under another leader.
I think there is an issue about the support for Labour generally, but I think that we can't forget the years of the investment that Labour's put in. You can't forget the investments in better schools, better housing, more things for young people to do, more places to go and so on. We can't forget that all that investment.
Okay, but the point of the question is those achievements that are, in your view, being overshadowed by the unpopularity of Gordon Brown?
I think that the public is more astute than that. I think that they're going to the public is quite aware that the notion of the celebrity culture, that Gordon Brown isn't about being that personality. And I think we've got a more astute public than that. And I think what it will come down to on the day is the agenda that is set. And I don't think the Conservatives are in a position where they're setting that agenda. They've got an opportunity to set it, and they're not setting it.
Greg Costa, you want to come in here?
Just over a year ago, the most unpopular person was Tony Blair. So I think Brown has blown it to the extent that he had a golden opportunity when he took over that mantle. And it seems hard to remember now, with where we are in the polls, that there was a sort of honeymoon period. And when Brown first took office at number 10, for a short period, he couldn't do anything wrong. And there was a huge sort of well of support, I think, from certainly Labour Party members, but the general public. And he had that opportunity to distance himself from some of the things that were unpopular with Blairism and some of those disastrous policy decisions that people associated with Tony Blair, and then we went back to just more of the same.
Did they make a mistake getting rid of Tony Blair, or was it Gordon's mistake in not, riding the tide of optimism that there was when he took over?
Absolutely right to get rid of Blair, but I think Brown had that opportunity and he's blown it.
Okay. Tony Devenish, your leader's polls better than Gordon Brown, but is your party just a leader? I mean, the voters don't seem to like the rest of the party. Like Cameron, they don't seem to like the rest of the party.
Well, I think, ultimately now we do live, dare I say, in a presidential age, and the party leader is very, very important now. And I think the fact that David has, I won't say closed the deal with the public, but certainly made enormous progress over the last 4 years is absolutely important. And, the point about the party is running local government, and I'm a great believer in local government, local democracy as well. And I think up and down the country, Conservative councillors are delivering the kind of policies that hopefully in a year's time the Conservative government will be developing.
But, I mean, what are those policies? I mean, we've got a slightly clearer idea this week from George Osborne, the Shadow Chancellor.
Simple, as we say on Westminster Council,
still not a great deal.
It's quality public services, and it's a low council tax.
It's
value for money. It is actually I mean, you can say all these things, but ultimately it's about quality public services for value for money. And when we pay down the debt that this government has caused, that's what we will deliver.
Okay, Michael White. I mean, we dealt with this a bit before, but explain to me just why the Labour Party can't get rid of Gordon Brown. I mean, what possible interest is there in keeping him? I mean, apart from his own personal interest, it doesn't seem to be in anybody else's interest to keep him.
They don't have a credible, plausible alternative. People forget, Claudia's half right about personalities in politics, and Gordon Brown isn't a very charismatic leader. Tony's half right to say we live in a presidential celeb era, except that every time we have a presidential leader like Margaret Thatcher, we react against it and we replace them with somebody like John Major. Decent guy, John Major, but not a charismatic leader. Then we get Tony Blair, charismatic leader. We replace them with somebody who says, I'm not going to be having pop stars into number 10 Downing Street. I'm not interested in celebrity. And yet, within a very short period of time, he's playing the celeb game. Silly boy. Why? He lacks confidence in himself, Brown. It's a terrible thing. He's a clever man. People forget, Tony certainly does, when the world banking system was about to collapse almost a year ago this year, Lehman Brothers went down. The plan, I was reading it in the FT only the other day, the plan which came up to recapitalise the banks came from the British government, from number 10 and number 11 Downing Street. Within a week it was followed in Washington, Paris and Bonn. They all say, like Tony says, oh, we're against borrowing money and spending money. They all did it. The Chinese government pumped in more than almost anyone to keep unemployment down and keep the Chinese economy growing. And touch wood, isn't any wood here, touch wood, it's worked.
Touch plastic.
But here's one thing where I take issue with Claudia here, though. She says it's not about personality. It's about policy and matters of substance. So it is, but it's inseparable from personality and from leadership. Now, I know she's an admirer of Nelson Mandela, so am I. But if you said, what if Thabo Mbeki, the last president of South Africa and leader of the ANC during the negotiations for the end of apartheid, could Mbeki have done it as well as Mandela? Of course he couldn't. Personality, in this case, Mandela's extraordinary skillful personality, was the vital crucible which made it a peaceful transition. So personality matters as well as issues. He couldn't have done it on his own. Nobody can, but he's a critical figure.
So on the question how much of his woes can be blamed on Gordon Brown, what do you reckon? Is there a balance? Can you put a percentage on it?
Well, you've been in power for 12 years. You run out of luck, you run out of excuses, you run out of energy, you run out of ideas, you run out of people. So you appoint teenagers to the cabinet doing work experience.
Anyone in mind there, Michael?
No, I couldn't possibly name anybody, Andy. And that's, that's the way it goes in government. It happened to Margaret Thatcher. I always say to people, George Washington, first president of the United States, very smart fellow. 8 years is enough for anybody. Even Vladimir Putin in Moscow pretends to agree with that. He's put another bloke in to keep his seat warm for 4 years. So, you've got to give up. So Blair was right to go, even though he'd have probably been better placed to win this election than Gordon Brown is. Do you remember he said in his last speech, he said, if we can't beat this lot, we shouldn't be in politics. I often think of that, because they're beatable, but they won't be beaten by Mr. Brown.
All right, another question. This one's from Femi Taylor. Femi Taylor, your question, yeah.
Yeah, why is it that Labour's not getting the credit it deserves for actually saving the economy?
Why is it that Labour's not getting the credit it deserves for saving the economy? Greg Foxsmith.
Well, I think we've touched on this a bit earlier in the conversations that we've had.
Well, do we accept the premise of the question first, that Labour did save the economy? You seem to do so.
No, I don't. I mean, I think it goes back to Brown's association with the bankers, because I think it's right that the bankers have to shoulder the blame for the economic crisis. But if it's also about leadership, as we've just been saying, and where have the leadership of the Labour Party put themselves in relation to the bankers? So if you look at the approach of Vince Cable compared to what the government have been, and their Mansion House speech and their praising of the deregulated financial sector and their lauding of the banking system, they're inextricably linked. So you can't really blame the banking system without looking at the Labour Party's links with it.
OK, but again, it's not about what caused it in the first place, it's about the response to it when it happened. Do you think, I mean, lots of quite important people, Nobel Prize-winning economists, other governments have praised Gordon Brown as the instigator of the package that was eventually rolled out across the West to save the economy from utter collapse?
Well, that's a bit like, you know, being first on the scene after a car crash if you've caused the car crash. I mean, I think that, again, you know, you can't draw that distinction between the person who's responsible for the mess and then trying to praise themselves for what they've done about mopping it up afterwards.
Claudia Webbe, briefly, we've got about 2 minutes before the break, and then I'll come to the others afterwards.
No, I mean, I think that Gordon Brown ought to be praised rightly because he had the right policies on the table. It was about the necessary investment, the necessary borrowing and the necessary stimulus. The problem is that the Conservatives' response was to focus on debt. Well, you can't focus on debt without focusing on public investment.
But it kind of worked, because, I mean, Gordon is not getting the credit. He's not...
But the problem is the Conservatives are getting nothing in terms of a response.
OK, but the question is about why Gordon didn't get the credit.
Gordon ought to have got, well, he ought to have got the credit, and I still believe that fundamentally the voters will recognise that and will see that and he'll win out on that, because if left to the Tories, and we have to remember what the Tories would have provided, left to them, we wouldn't have had the borrowing and the stimulus required. We would have had a focus on debt, and we wouldn't have had the ability to address the rising unemployment, and that's why Gordon Brown's got it right in terms of the public investment that is necessary. The problem is, however, in a sense, as Labour, we are putting it on a plate by saying to them, by buying into this argument about cuts in public sector.
OK, hold that thought. That is all we've got time for on this break. We'll take a short break, but we will be back in a few moments for more of this topical debate. Stay with us. I'm Andrew Gilligan. Today we're discussing the apparent demise or the alleged demise of New Labour and whether it's actually going to happen, whether it's necessary. Our next question is from Chris Byrne. Chris Byrne, your question.
How much will the Sun's decision to back the Tories influence the outcome of the election?
How much will the Sun's decision to back the Tories influence the outcome of the next election? Announced about 10 minutes after Gordon Brown sat down. Michael White, you're a journalist.
I thought the question was going to say how much will it cost David Cameron? Quite a lot, I imagine, cash up front. Interesting, not entirely facetious, Mr Cameron had already made an attack upon too many quangos, but the one quango he singled out was Ofcom, which is a regulator of television, and of course that was the one which James Murdoch singled out for attack in his McTaggart lecture in Edinburgh. The Murdochs like to be on the winning side, and like most of us in the panel, they've decided that the Conservatives are the winning side this time. They always support the communists in Beijing, and they're the winning side there all the time. Anyway, how much damage will it do to Labour is really what the question meant. Less than the Sun thinks. The Sun, like all newspapers, including mine, is losing circulation, but my more general point is that newspapers rather follow their readers instead of leading them. They decide what their readers are feeling, they do a lot of market research, so they follow the crowd rather than lead it. So I think probably many Sun readers, for a whole range of reasons, fed up with Labour, want a different government, and are voting accordingly, and the Sun gets in behind them. So some damage. The timing was meant to be quite serious damage, although some people said As we've said before in this conversation, if they'd been much keener on Cameron, they would have waited until the Conservative conference and done it that way and put Mr Cameron's picture on the front page, which they did not. And they'd have had a page 3 girl called Sam in honour of Mrs Cameron. Instead, they had one called Harriet to take the mickey out of poor Harriet Harman. Isn't that rotten?
Tony Devonish, the fact is that they in fact didn't say vote Tory. They said Labour's lost it. It wasn't an endorsement of Cameron, it was an attack on Labour. They're not terribly keen on kind of David Cameron, hugger hoodie style Toryism.
Well, I read The Sun the following day from cover to cover.
That kind of taken long.
Well, there was 3 or 4 pages actually of normal people, hard-working British people, from pensioners to young mums, all the different parts of the population. And it was what they said about this government. They said this government had completely and utterly failed them. There were stories in there about armed service personnel, pensioners, young mums, and they all said, what have we got after 12 years of New Labour? And pretty much all of them, not quite all of them, but most of them came out and said, we like what we see with David Cameron, we're going to give him a go. So that's what I'm more interested in, what normal people up and down this country say, not what the editor of a national newspaper says.
Do you think it will have an influence on the election? That was the question.
Well, I think I agree almost with Michael on this point. I think newspapers are losing their influence compared to the 80s, when, of course, The Sun came out for Mrs Thatcher. So I don't think there's a direct correlation, but it's always nice to get the support of any national newspaper, but I'm more interested in each and every one of their readers.
And let me deal with this point Michael White made about Ofcom, the broadcasting regulator. The fact is, Sky, Rupert Murdoch's channel, wants something that Ofcom doesn't want to give it. It wants powers and monopolies that Ofcom wants to prevent it from having. David Cameron has promised to rein Ofcom in. Isn't that the most blatant instance of political interference?
I mean, you always get this kind of media story. I don't think anybody in the public is interested in this at all.
Well, they should be, because it's about the plurality of democracy.
And, you know, no, it's a media-driven
So you're not denying
story.
it, right? This is the deal that's been done.
No, I'm not.
I'll hobble Ofcom if you give me your support.
I mean, I think that's a bit of conspiracy thinking, really, from you, Andrew, really.
Okay, but so that's not a denial either. I mean, conspiracy theories can sometimes be true.
I haven't spoken to David about this directly myself in my lowly level in the party, but I do think you're being a bit conspiracy.
All right, Claudia Webbe, are you a Sun reader? Do you read it every day?
I'm not necessarily a Sun reader, and I'd hate to think that we've yet reached a day in UK politics where the media are determining the democratic outcome of an election. I'd quite like.
I mean, the party was pretty upset when the Sun jumped ship, wasn't it? It was pretty upset at that compromise.
The Sun moved within moments of the Prime Minister's speech, as though it already had it pre-prepared and pre-planned for more of the same sensationalism. And I think that that's what the Sun has been renowned for. Whilst we can't underestimate its effect, nonetheless we can't allow it to determine the democratic outcome of politics. Otherwise we might as well all give, rip up our party cards now and go home and allow the media to set the political agenda from this day forth. And I think the public are more astute than that, and I think that actually, the Sun will create the stories to support their frontline headline.
But here's the thing. I mean, the party, courted the Sun absolutely assiduously in the run-up to the 97 election. Alistair Campbell wrote in his diaries that getting the endorsement of the Sun was tremendously important to him. It was one of the most important things that had happened. And now that they've turned away, he's all over the telly saying it doesn't matter. I mean, you can't have it both ways. But was it Labour almost that bigged up the Sun in its efforts to court it?
You're asking, is there this relationship between politics and the media that enables one to feed off the other?
Was it you that gave the Sun this kind of sense of self-importance that it's got, that it can bring
I don't think we can attribute the rise in the media's involvement in politics in the way that we've got it now to any one political party. I think that that's a whole new debate in a sense in terms of the role that the media plays in politics, and it's a big agenda. We've got the advancement of new technology that means actually that we're getting political news long before some of the broadsheets and so on. So there's a whole debate going on about to what extent do we allow the media to lead that political agenda? And I think we've just got to be going back to the grassroots politics and understanding what's really going on the doorstep.
I think it's a failure of the two main parties that they've courted the media. They've done it through focus groups and through research, and they've let the media set the agenda, not just the Sun, but the Daily Mail and some of the the popular papers that they think a large section of the population read. And what they've done is they've then followed that agenda. They've allowed themselves to be led by those popular media. For example, a sentencing arms race, or on civil liberties stuff, some of the language that we've seen in the media about asylum seekers and the poorest in society, and on drugs classification and war on drugs, all of those issues. They've tailored their policies to what they think the papers are going to give them credit and praise for. I think it's a terrible shame.
We're being a bit pessimistic here. In a way, this is an old-fashioned conversation, because the internet and Twitter enables voters out there to have a much greater input into politics and political thinking, and a much greater effect on things than was ever possible before. In the last few days, we've had an attempt by an aggressive libel firm of libel lawyers, Carter Ruck, to shut down a Guardian investigation, and Twitter, and to shut down it being reported in Parliament either, and Twitter played a major role in overthrowing this, and the gagging order was withdrawn. And that applies to grassroots politics too. Your party is actually very good at it. Barack Obama was brilliant at it, and all the political parties moving away from the tabloids a bit, concentrating on the new media, but the Sun is still there, and I sometimes say to people, the Sun is like being locked in a cage with a randy gorilla. You feed it bananas in case it starts taking an interest in you. So that's what all the parties do. They feed the Sun bananas.
I mean, the fact is, Greg Pottsmith, the Sun did do Labour, OK, under old media conditions, but the Sun did do Labour enormous damage in the 1980s. It consistently belittled Neil Kinnock, and even though people might not have obeyed its orders how to vote, that kind of drip of stuff, Kinnock certainly thinks it did him real damage.
Yes, and also back to Michael Foot as well, and there were some very personal attacks in that. But yes, I think things have moved on from there, but the sadness is the way in which parties have responded to that, and instead of buying out into the interests of the newspapers and hoping to get a good headline, I think parties should be more mature and braver and set out an agenda and lead the debate. And I think the Twittering and modern technology is going to be a positive force for doing that. But I think the parties have to break away from the clutches of the newspapers and their fear of a day's bad press, which is just tomorrow's fish and chip
Question from the audience. Come in there, yeah, guy in the leather jacket.
I actually like where you're going there, that actually embracing technology. I think that's definitely the way forward. My question is really just thinking more positively. What can be done realistically to improve the image of the Labour Party now?
Okay, well, let's put that to Claudia Webbe before we move on. I mean, you're the Labour Party's head of communications, let's say. Great job. And you want to improve the image of the Labour Party. What would you do? One or two things.
Well, I mean, I think that the Labour Party, I mean, one of the interesting things after that whole Sun debacle was that actually what presented itself was greater unity amongst left-leaning people.
So, what would you do to improve the image of the Labour Party? I mean, you're talking about it has to be about personality policy rather than personality.
It is.
A couple of substantive policies, maybe?
Well, the policies are substantive.
No, I mean a couple of new substantive policies.
Well,
forgive me. Anything in mind?
One of the things we do.
I'm asking this to Claudia Webbe. Give me. I'll come back.
No,
to you in a
I said right at the top of the hour that it is about leading on policies enables you to win, and I think that's where the Labour Party has to continue to lead on the policies and continue to put out those issues and those political agendas.
Rehashing the same policies. I mean, the conference speech had nothing new to offer. It was
I think you're wrong there. I think we constantly identify ourselves on addressing social needs. And I think once we continue to say that what we are about is addressing social needs and injustice, tackling injustice, dealing with poverty, dealing with all of those things that matter to ordinary people, I think that is what will be that's what will take us forward, because we have to constantly remind ourselves that we can't actually rely on the Tories to develop the policies that are necessary to address social needs.
Okay, let me come back to the question. Is there anything that would turn you, if you are a Labour sceptic, from being a Labour sceptic into a supporter? Is there any particular policy you want to see that could turn it around for the party?
I think just simple proactivity would do it for me. That would make me feel better. Trailblazing. If I see this constant following happening, then I would feel like, okay, well, why would I vote for somebody that's really following somebody else, or looking to see what somebody else wants and going with the majority? I want to see trailblazing.
Let's try another question. This is from Mary Schnorenberg. Mary Schnorenberg.
Yep. Are the Tories actually fit to govern?
Are the Tories fit to govern? Tony Devonish.
We were talking about the media a second, and the old media. I'd like to talk about the new media. It's a wonderful site, Conservative Home, and every day some of the brightest people in this society, not just Conservative Party members, but across the political mainstream, get on that site. They blog effectively their views. And if you look at that site, it's not just MPs and councillors like myself. It's normal people and think tank people and the media as well on that site. Please read the site, and then I hope you won't ask a question with quite that tone.
Well,
I do believe,
how does that prove you're fit to govern?
I think we are reflecting society in this country now. We do understand that we are here to govern for the whole society. I think in the past Labour were very good at portraying us in a different light, but in the last few years under David Cameron that has changed. And if you listen to the speeches that George gave last week, or David himself, I don't think there's any doubt that we're fit to govern, and hopefully the British people will give us that chance in 8 months' time.
What about you, Greg Foxsmith? I mean, you were pretty unkind to the Tories in your conference, but then you have been for quite a while.
Yeah, I mean, let's just look at practical examples. Are the Tories fit to govern? Well, we could have a look at Boris and his record and what he's done so far in London.
He's very popular.
We could look at what's going on in Europe.
What's wrong with Boris's running of London, just to be specific here?
Well, I think if we look at the Transport for London funding, we're seeing he's not really tackling, the problems. He's not delivering on his promises. I mean, Boris is popular because he comes across as a populist, person. We like his buffoonery, but if you strip away underneath, the veneer, he's not delivering. He's breaking his promises.
Let's talk, very briefly about Boris Johnson. I mean, the fact is he doesn't seem to know where he's going on some policies. He's still talking about scrapping the Western Extension, then he's going to bring it back, then he's going to scrap it, he's going to have another congestion charge somewhere else.
Boris is a great figurehead, he's a great leader, and behind him is a hugely experienced team, including two of my former bosses, Simon Milton.
Answer the question.
It's run by Westminster Council.
Yes.
Well, there's nothing wrong with that, and Boris is a great member. He's the mayor, and democratically we have several deputy mayors. That's, we are a team. Unlike Gordon Brown, who is Gordon Brown and the Pygmy Cabinet, we have a team.
All right, okay.
I'm delighted about that.
There is something quite problematic about the way that Boris is moving forward. He's about trying to cut public services under the guise of efficiency and effectiveness.
There's nothing wrong with efficiency.
But the reality is he's cutting minuscule areas, and it's a bit like taking...
So is he cutting or isn't he? You just said he was cutting, now you're saying he's not cutting. That's great.
But he's not addressing...
He's a very popular mayor, he's doing a great job.
He's not addressing the key social needs. What he's doing is cutting areas around environment, areas around public investment in
he's
transport.
addressing the issues he's allowed to do so under this government who actually put the bill through, and the mayor only has certain powers.
It's like a doctor addressing the symptom without finding a cure.
Let me put this to you. I mean, you talk about cuts as if they're wrong, but all parties appear to have accepted the need for cuts. There is a large public sector deficit in prospect, which our children and grandchildren spend the rest of their lives paying off if it's not drawn down. Don't you accept that?
I don't accept that the way forward is about cuts in public finances.
But your leader does.
No, well, this is where I think we're slightly wrong-footed, and we've laid the agenda on the table for the Tories. And I think we need to take back that agenda, because we've got increasing unemployment, and And cutting public finances when you need it most is just the wrong way to go down.
All right, question from the audience before I go to Michael White. Woman in the front there, yeah.
Yeah, this is just about the Tories' claim for the social interests. I mean, for example, I'm a student and I read that the Tories, one of their policies is that they want to increase the tuition fees. I mean, how is that recruiting more votes from the students, for example?
Tony Devonish, answer that particular question and answer the question that what Britain needs now, when it's still in economic difficulties, is government spending. And Labour would cut spending too, but it wouldn't cut spending until we're out of the woods.
Well, that isn't true. I mean, you know as far as I do that the document came out of the Treasury only the other week, which said that 9.3% of public spending is going under this current government right now, and then they accuse the Tories of doing 10%. So I mean, the reality is we all know any party is going to have to cut. It's where you cut. We believe we have the experience, particularly from local government, of maintaining public services and cutting waste.
And this government is students.
And in terms of students, we're not saying we are going to decide this. We are saying we're going to give the universities the chance to decide. It will be a dialogue.
That's the same thing, isn't it?
No, it's not the same thing at all. It's about devolving power. It's not doing what Gordon Brown says and saying, I say we do it this way. We are saying we are actually going to devolve power. Universities are semi-autonomous bodies, and that, that's the way forward.
OK, Michael White, are the Tories fit to govern?
Well, yes and no, we'll see. Picking up a point, Tony's been saying the present government has done nothing. It's always a silly thing to say about any government. They've done lots of things. They've done some things well and badly. One of the things they did well, I'm afraid, it's unpopular, was introduce student tuition fees to keep the universities of this country up there in the top end of the World League. We had an extraordinary statistics the other week in which Cambridge came second after Harvard, having overtaken Yale. University College London, where I went many years ago, had overtaken Oxford, and we were up there. Now, the question of the Tories. He's quite right about the Conservative Home website. It's a very good website. It's run by a lot of smart people. You know when a party's winning, the smart people and the pretty girls come back on its side, and that's a good thing. You get
more than one way.
I know he did, but I'm not Steve Knowles. You get a swing. But the worrying thing about Conservative Home, and the worrying thing about the Osborne and Cameron speeches in Manchester the other day, was that you could hear the cash register. They were cutting all right, but they were also spending money. And they were also saying the state isn't the answer, it's the problem. And that sounds like Ronald Reagan. And everybody in the United States, except those in the United States, on the right wing of the United States, knows that's wrong.
Just quickly before I go to the audience, I mean, you trailed a proposal to put money into the pockets of old people. They would only have to pay £8,000 for their care, and then take money out of the pockets of young people. Now, young people on the whole are less well off than old people. How does that work? How does that prove you fit for government?
Again, I think trying to put one interest group against another is not the way to go forward, Andrew.
But I mean, students are the future of the country.
They are, absolutely, and they are. I was a student once, and I know it's hard for people now compared to when I was a student. But saying old people, young people,
is a figure too.
Yeah, okay. Yes. I mean, question from the back there, guy in the leather jacket, yeah.
Is it credible for the Tories to be claiming they're a party of the poor now?
Good question. Tony Devonish, answer that one. Sorry you're getting this, but it is a question about the Tories.
Absolutely. I mean, I think David Cameron's best line in his speech last week, and it was genuine passion, not just a line, was when he talked about Gordon Brown saying how he was going to end poverty, and poverty has gone up under this government.
No, it hasn't.
It has. The figures... Institute of Fiscal figures show that.
On what poverty you mean?
Between the richest and the poorest, that's a different proposition from poverty going up.
That's because after the inheritance of '97, I don't have a dog in this fight, but the Labour government pumped billions, mainly bankers' taxes, incidentally, into poverty, but they were running up a down escalator. You're right, different groups, but basically the worst of it has been improved. But it's still very bad, as
answer me this.
says.
I mean, inequality. Indisputably, inequality has grown in this country under Labour, under New Labour, and that's pretty indisputed. And Peter Mandelson was, of course, famously quoted as he had no objection to the rich becoming filthy rich or something of that nature.
Well, he taxed them. That was the point.
Answer me this: are you not committed to a benefit system, a welfare system that really locks quite a lot of the poor in poverty. That point that David Cameron made, that if somebody on an income of £150 takes, if somebody takes a job £150, then they lose 96% of that in clawback from the benefits they've lost. That's wrong, isn't it?
Well, there may be things that need to be tidied up and put right, but you can't you can't knock the Labour Party for putting the policies in the right place, introducing things like the minimum wage, ensuring that we've got investments in the poorest areas and where we've got areas of deprivation. But you can't. The question was, can the Tories claim to be the party of the poor? Well, you see, they're opportunists, and the Tories will claim anything as long as it wins them votes.
Well, you've been claiming it for many years, and you've failed to deliver.
But the Tories have got no intention of delivering, which is the point.
No, I don't doubt their sincerity. I don't doubt their sincerity or Cameron's sincerity, the answer to the questioner. But doing the things that David Cameron says he's going to do are really difficult. That's why Labour's found it so difficult to do, and he will find it difficult too. Good luck to him. He's earned his chance to try, but it'll be hard.
Okay, come back to me on that. You want to come back? Yeah.
It's part of the problem is that because it's post-industrial society, we don't really have a working class any longer.
I want to bring that point brings me to our last question, and one-word answers pretty much from everyone, which is from Patty DeShiva. Patty DeShiva.
Is there really any difference between the minority parties?
Any difference between any of the parties? I mean, all right, one-word answer. Obviously, the Liberal Democrats are completely different in every way, but is there any difference between the Tories and Labour in your view?
No.
Claudia Webbe.
Tons of difference. You know, Thatcherism will be remembered for individualism. The question is, what will new Tories be remembered for?
Tony Devonish, I think I know your answer to this one.
Well, I actually could agree with Labour candidate for once, so there we go.
All right.
There's a huge amount of difference. Blue, clear water.
One-word answers.
Michael White.
We'll find out after election day, and we'll get a different government, and some of you will be pleased and some of you will be horrified. Of course there's a difference.
Okay, that, I'm afraid, is all we've got time for. But once again, if you'd like to be part of the audience here in London, please do call our hotline on 0208 728 6472 or email us at forum@presstv.co.uk. But from me and the panel, it's goodbye until next time.